All right, how's everybody doing? Hotep, hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, and writer. It's Wednesday, June 19th, 2019. It's Juneteenth, and we're live. Hope everybody's doing all right today. So I wanted to talk about three main topics today. We're going to deal some of the brief history of Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. Then I'll talk a little bit about the HR 40 reparations hearing that took place today in the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. Okay, I watched the last 2 hours of it. It was about 3 hours and 30 minutes in total. I watched the last 2 hours of it. So we'll talk, I'm going to talk some about that and then let you know about the online course that I'm teaching this evening, Wednesday, June 19th, 2019, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, dealing with ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Okay, yeah, Nikki, yeah, we're back. So we're broadcasting on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, Imhotep, and our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network. Okay. So a broadcast, it should be on, I'm trying to see, why isn't this on Facebook fan page? It should be there. Okay. But I hope everybody's doing well. Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. Okay. All right. So when we look at Juneteenth, you know, I did a 3-hour presentation dealing with the history of Juneteenth, and I'm in the process of putting it on DVD, so it'll be available this night. It'll be available this evening to order from our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. But it deals with the history of Juneteenth, and I go into some other things, deal with the Civil War, things like that. And we'll have it on digital download also. We're talking about June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. All right. So Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army goes into Texas actually on the day before June 18th, 1865. And this is basically 2 weeks after the Civil War ended. Civil War officially ends June 2nd, 1865. And he delivers General Order number 3. There are about 250,000 enslaved Africans there in Texas in general, in Texas. And when we look at this history of Texas, we see that there were very few Civil War battles fought in Texas. Texas was more removed from the actual Civil War, from actual battles in the Civil War. And you're going to have some slave owners that flee and go into Texas and take their slaves into Texas as well. Okay. So General Gordon Granger on June 19th, 1865, delivered General Order number 3. Okay. And what this did was this freed those enslaved Africans that were still enslaved even after the Civil War had officially ended. So if we look at what General Order number 3 actually says, okay, and history.com has an article dealing with Juneteenth, and NBCnews.com has an article dealing with Juneteenth as well. 9 things to know about the history of Juneteenth. Well, if we look at General Order number 3, it says the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Okay, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and property rights between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. Employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. Okay, the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Okay, so this is what was delivered June 19th, 1865. We know that the sharecropping system is going to be used in many southern states to continue to exploit the labor of African Americans. Now, you're going to have some slave owners who keep the message of General Order Number 3 from their slaves to exploit their labor for an additional year, going into 1866. Okay, we see this happen. So the majority of enslaved Africans are going to be freed because of General Order Number 3, but not all of them. Now, one slave owner who wanted to keep her enslaved Africans for another year, her name was Martha Gibbs, Gibbs, Martha Gibbs. And she was a white female slave owner. All right. Now, if you saw the broadcast that I did back on June 9th, it dealt with a history of how about 40% of slave owners from 1850 to 1860 were white women. Okay, about 40% of slave owners from 1850 to 1860 were white women. And there's new research that came from Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers at University of California, Berkeley. Okay, and I did a broadcast about that. It's on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, and our YouTube channel also, Michael Imhotep. Okay, all right. So let's see. We have Arlene, Wise Nubian. Just a few of the people watching here on our YouTube channel. Okay. And also talk some about Senator Mitch McConnell's crazy comments, talking about he's against reparations, trying to correct something that happened 150 years ago. I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for which none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. But Americans still benefit from what enslaved Africans built, from the labor, from the wealth that was generated by enslaved Africans. Americans still benefit from that today. So you want the benefits of slavery, but you don't want the debt. You don't want the liability of slavery. You have no problem benefiting from the benefits of slavery, but you have a problem dealing with the liability of it. This is what Mitch McConnell is really saying. Okay, so Martha Gibbs, one woman, Martha Gibbs, even took enslaved people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866, a year after slavery's formal abolition. This is an article from history.com entitled "The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners." The massive overlooked role of female slave owners. This is from March 12, 2019. And so this was in some of the research coming from Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers at the University of California, Berkeley, African-American female professor. And then also in the article from, I think she's mentioned in the New York Times as well. Let me see here. Well, in the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. There's an article from AtlantaBlackStar.com also. There's an article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. And that is from AtlantaBlackStar.com. And it talks about Martha Gibbs in that one as well. Let's see. Okay. But you're going to have some slave owners that do this. They withhold the information from the enslaved Africans, delivered June 19th, 1865, and they're going to be freed in 1866. Okay. All right. So they're not going to be compensated in general with land. And even though you have special field order number 15, known as 40 acres and a mule, that only applied to 40,000 former slaves. That only applied to 40,000 former slaves. There's a good article from blackpast.org that deals with the history of 40 acres and a mule. Okay, and it's called 40 acres and a mule at blackpast.org. I'll try to pull it up and post a link here. But that only applied to coastal land in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. That applied to coastal land. And it did not apply to all of the land in the South. It applied to 400,000 acres of land that was former land of the slave owners, the plantation owners, that was confiscated. And it was divided up into plots of up to 40 acres. Okay. So what's going to happen is you have this land that is allocated, and most of it is going to be taken back. It's going to be vetoed by President Andrew Johnson. Johnson is sympathetic to the Confederacy. He succeeded Lincoln after Lincoln is assassinated. Lincoln shot April 14th, 1865, dies the next morning, 7:22 a.m. So President Andrew Johnson was sympathetic to the Confederacy. He gives a blanket pardon to the Confederates who committed treason against the U.S. government. And these former slaves, is basically 4 million former slaves, are never compensated in general with land, never compensated properly, especially with land. Now you're going to have Homestead Acts, the Homestead Act of 1862, signed May 20th, 1862, which is going to redistribute about 245 million acres of land. For 100 years, African Americans are largely shut out of that. So if you watch the hearing today, dealing with HR 40 in reparations, the bill to create a commission to study reparations and come up with recommendations for reparations as well. Dr. Julian Malveaux, who is an economist, and I know Dr. Julian Malveaux, I've interviewed her before. Need to interview her again. She did a really good job today. I think there should have been more historians on the panel. You needed like a Dr. Leonard Jeffries, even the Dr. Henry Louis Skip the Truth Gates would not have been bad because he's from Harvard. But his background is not really history. His bachelor's is in history. His background really is in African American literature. But you needed like a Dr. Leonard Jeffries. Dr. Claude Anderson would have been good on the panel. I need to call him and see how he's doing also, because I know he's been sick some. But you needed some more historians really on the now. Ta-Nehisi Coates did a good job. Okay, Ta-Nehisi Coates is not a historian, but he wrote the article in 2014 for the Atlantic. The case for reparations. And this is why he was called to testify. He shed some really, really good light on after really 246 years of slavery, going into decades of Jim Crow segregation, housing, redlining when it comes to housing, things like this. So he shed some really good information on that. But check out this article, theatlantic.com. Theatlantic.com, the case for reparations is about a 17-page article, expose he did. So he really did some good research putting this together. But I'm going to go to this article here from npr.org in just a minute. But all this deals with history. We have to understand the chronology of history. You can't separate what's taking place today and the conditions of America today. You can't separate that from its history. Okay. We have to understand how the conditions today are influenced by a sequence of historical events. So coming out of slavery, 1865. You have the labor unions that are created. A lot of labor unions are created, like the National Labor Union, created in 1866. And these labor unions are going to lock African Americans largely out of these labor unions after we have been doing these jobs for free. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. After the Civil War ends, 13th Amendment, December 6, 1865, it's ratified. Now we can compete for wages. So now you have these labor unions that are created, these large labor unions created, not like the National Labor Union. Later, you're going to have the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And what they're going to do is protect jobs for white men. So they're going to exclude African Americans out of these jobs after we had been doing the work for free for 246 years. Our skills were as good as Europeans, or in many cases, even better than Europeans. All right. And they're going to give these jobs to white men and also white immigrants coming to this country also. This is something that's not talked about a lot. Dr. Claude Anderson deals with this in Black Labor, White Wealth, and then also in How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy. They talk about this as well. Okay, this is a deep book. This is the third edition, How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy, from the Nation of Islam Research Group. Go to NOI.org, and you can order that book. It's only like $10. But it deals with a whole chronology of this history, how the public policies and laws have been used against African Americans for hundreds of years. Okay, so in 1862, you're going to have the Homestead Act of 1862. Okay, in the Homestead Act, what this is going to do is give 160 acres of land to the head of household. And what they have to do is maintain that land for 5 years, pay the taxes on it. If they do that, the land is theirs. There's an article from history.com, the official website of the History Channel. Okay, this is one example of the massive land giveaway. These were affirmative action policies for white people. All right. Now, this is not hate speech or anything like this. I'm breaking down history. I'm dealing with history. All right. I know with certain social media platforms, they've had changes in the last few weeks dealing with hate speech or what have you. No, I'm citing history. So if we look at this article from history.com, the official website of the History Channel, called Homestead Act. It talks about how the Homestead Act was signed into law in May of 1862, actually May 20th, 1862. And the Homestead Act opened up settlement in the Western United States, allowing any American, including freed slaves, to put in a claim for up to 160 acres of federal land. Now, what's going to happen is African Americans, the former slaves, are largely going to be excluded from actually getting the land. Okay, you may have an exception here or there, but we're largely excluded from it. By the end of the Civil War, so this is 1862. Civil War ends 1865. By the end of the Civil War, 15,000 homestead claims had been established, and more followed in the post-war years. Eventually, 1.6 million individual claims would be approved, nearly 10% of all government-held property, for a total of 420,000 square miles of territory. They're going to give away land for the next 100 years, the Homestead Act. They're going to give away, actually it's over 100 years, because the last allotment of land was allocated in about 1988. Is about 80 acres of land in Alaska. So they gave out about 245 million acres of land over the course of over 100 years. It's past 100 years that they gave away this land. So now, if we look at an example here, Senator Mitch McConnell on Tuesday, senator from Kentucky. Now, Kentucky is one of those former slaveholding states. Now, Kentucky was not a Confederate state. Kentucky stayed loyal to the Union, and it was known as a border state, B-O-R-D-E-R. It was known as a border state. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was delivered January 1st, 1863, by President Abraham Lincoln, if you read the Emancipation Proclamation, you can go to loc.gov, Library of Congress website, loc.gov, or you can go to archives.gov. It basically tells you that the slaves in states of rebellion or territories of rebellion, those slaves are free. Slaves in the border states are still slaves. So Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, they're going to stay loyal to the Union. These were known as border states. They stayed loyal to the Union, and they still were able to maintain that. They still kept their slaves until, the Civil War ends. All right. So the Emancipation Proclamation is issued January 1st, 1863. This was the second one. The initial one was September 22nd, 1862. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy to bring the South back into the Union. This is what this was about. It was a military strategy to bring the South back into the Union. Lincoln's goal was not to free the slaves. His goal was to maintain the Union. And I get deep in this. I did a 3-hour presentation deal with Juneteenth. I get deep into this. Okay. So I'm just skimming the surface with it for the sake of time. So the Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1863, stated that if the states in rebellion had until January 1st, 1863 to surrender. If they did not, their slaves would be set free. Okay, this is what it stated. So since they didn't surrender, January 1st, 1863, Lincoln delivers the Emancipation Proclamation. But it's not going to be the 13th Amendment that's what's actually going to free the enslaved Africans. I also encourage people, you've heard me talk about it before, read this document, read this study. Download this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, splcenter.org, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. Because this study documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in schools all across the country. And it gives strategies and recommendations on how to more correctly and accurately teach the history of slavery. If we're ever going to get reparations, you've heard me say this before, America needs a massive history lesson. Americans are woefully ignorant of history. White Americans and African Americans are woefully ignorant of history. Okay. When you see some of the comments that I saw from some of the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee today, the subcommittee, you can tell they're ignorant of history. When you have someone like a Mitch McConnell saying, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for which none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. Okay. Then he goes on to talk about, let's see, so I'm looking at the article from the Washington Post. In addition to noting that the perpetrators of slavery are dead, Mitch McConnell argued that, quote, it would be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate, end quote. We leave that up to the committee to do that. If we look at, if you saw the broadcast I did a few months ago dealing with Georgetown University, reconciling voting for a fund to help benefit the descendants of the enslaved Africans that Georgetown sold back in about 1838, okay, for $115,000. What they did was they hired genealogists, okay, to be able to help identify who the descendants of these slaves were. New York Times has a deep article dealing with what they went through to do this. Okay, so we leave that up to the committee. We don't have to sit here and figure it out now. We leave that to the committee to figure out how to identify the people who are descendants of slaves. But as Ta-Nehisi Coates made a point today, who wrote the article, The Case for Reparations, as he made a point today, he said, when we look at that first generation of Caribbean, Black people coming from the Caribbean, the Jamaicans, the Haitians, things like this, or we look at them coming from Nigeria, Ghana, what have you, that first generation, we see them, they'll in general do very well. But that second generation, that third generation, they don't do as well as that first generation. And that second generation, third generation, they get lumped into just all Black people, African Americans, what have you. All right. And so if you go to our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, We have the full three-hour plus broadcast of the HR 40 hearing. Okay, go watch the whole thing. So Mitch McConnell went on to say, he also contended that the country has addressed its historic racial injustices in part through the election of President Barack Obama. Now, this is, if you go back to 2008, because the election was November 2008, you had conservative commentators on TV at the time. He was on ABC News, George Will, who said that, well, now something to the effect of, Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, they're going to be out of business now, something like that. This proves that racism is over with in this country. That's a bunch of nonsense. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, resources, benefits, privileges, land, access to education, access to opportunity, media, healthcare, schools, jobs, money, etc. Land, and they use that to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. That's what racism is. Racism has nothing to do. Racism is not on an individual basis. It's not person to person. It's not one white person to one African American. Racism is a group to group relationship. It deals with the laws, the policies, the educational system, the criminal justice system. Okay. This is what racism is. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. So if we understand it based upon that, and that definition is understanding racism based upon a history, the last 500 years of history, is different than the definition that Webster's going to give you. The definition from Webster is incorrect. In this, if you study Dr. Joy DeGruy, post-traumatic slave syndrome, Dr. Claude Anderson at Powernomics and Black Labor White Wealth, you'll see this. Then we have to ask the question, what is a system? A system is not a computer program. A system, and when I'm talking about racism being a system of advantage and privilege, a system is not a computer program. A system is not something that's abstract, right? A system is not the cloud. No, a system is a group of people who have been indoctrinated with a certain ideology, and they work to enforce, preserve, maintain, and uphold that ideology. That's what a system is. So if people have been indoctrinated with a system of white supremacy and racism, then that means if they have been taught that, then that means that process has to be reversed, because they've been taught to uphold a system of white supremacy and racism. They have been taught to vote based upon that. They have been taught to support policies that enforce that. They have been taught to, they've been totally miseducated on the history of this country, the history of slavery, the history of this country, period. All that goes into having people to uphold a system, including white Americans, even when that system doesn't benefit them, when that system does not largely benefit them. This is why you got a lot of poor white people who keep voting Republican, because they think the Republicans are going to help them. But actually, if you look at the Republican Party, Republican policies, they largely hurt poor white people who keep voting for Republicans. We saw this in Kentucky. In Kentucky, back in 2016, thinkprogress.org has an article on this. In Kentucky, I'm just going to give you this one example, but there are numerous examples. If we just look at the poor people's campaign, you look at the presidential town hall meeting they had just a few days ago. I think it was Monday, and they had some of the candidates there. The poor people's campaign is working with poor white people, poor Hispanics, poor African Americans, because they got more in common than they do differences. They're all poor. If you look at what was I going to say? Okay, so you had a poor people's campaign, Reverend William Barber III. But if you look at, for instance, in Kentucky, that's what I was talking about. Kentucky. Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. 2016, Kentucky got a Republican-dominated state legislature and a Republican governor. The first thing they did in Kentucky, one of the very first laws, if not the first law, these Republicans passed were right-to-work laws. Right-to-work laws drive down wages across the board. So now there are about 27, 28 states that are right-to-work states. Some of the very poor white Republicans who voted for Republicans to put them in office then were hurt by the right to work laws, which systematically drive down wages about $3,000 per person on average per year. This is what right to work laws do. Okay. And right to work laws are heavily pushed by the Koch brothers through one of their nonprofit groups, Americans for Prosperity. But you have a lot of white people who will, and this is not hate speech. I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about understanding this. Okay. You will have them, some poor white people who will vote for Republicans because they think that Republicans are going to deny resources to African Americans and Hispanics. But the same poor white people are also being hurt as well. When we look at healthcare, you had a lot of these Southern Republican states that did not want to sign up for the Medicaid expansion, who are trying to dismantle the Affordable Health Care Act, okay, ostensibly known as Obamacare, but it's benefiting a lot of poor white people. So, and New York Times had an article from about 2016, 2017 that dealt with how about 1/3 of Americans did not know the Affordable Health Care Act and Obamacare were the same thing. What happened was a lot of white people found out they were the same thing. They found out they had them. So you started seeing a massive uprising across the country of people saying, don't take away my health care. Okay, fighting to maintain the Affordable Health Care Act because they found out they had it. Now, see, in Kentucky, it's called Kentucky Connect. The Affordable Health Care Act is called Kentucky Connect. A lot of white people had it, they had Kentucky Connect. They didn't know that was Obamacare. See, now, and see, during the 2016 campaign, Trump talked about repeal and replace Obamacare. He called it Obamacare generally. He didn't call it the Affordable Health Care Act in general during the campaign, during the presidential election. So you had a whole lot of white people saying, oh, get rid of Obamacare. Okay, don't get rid of the Affordable Health Care Act, get rid of Obamacare. They didn't know they were the same thing. All right, so this is an example of why Senator Mitch McConnell must be voted out of office. He's up for a re-election in 2020. Okay, people in Kentucky have to do the damn thing and vote his ass out of office. All right, and Democrats have to take back control of the U.S. Senate. U.S. Senate is extremely important. People don't understand how important the U.S. Senate is. Mitch McConnell right now is blocking most of the bills that the House of Representatives are passing. There have been something like 258 bills that the House has passed since January 3rd, 2019. The overwhelming majority of those bills, Mitch McConnell is blocking in the Senate. Won't even allow them to come to the Senate floor for a debate. Won't allow a vote on the bills. Why? Because he's Senate Majority Leader. The Senate Majority Leader controls which bills get debated on the Senate floor and which bills get voted on the Senate floor. So even if HR 40 passes the House of Representatives, Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and see Republicans are in control of the U.S. Senate. This is an example of how elections have consequences. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, or treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Politics impacts every aspect of your life, okay? From the regulations on Facebook, all right, to the radio station that you listen to, the radio station you listen to in your car, that's FCC regulated, okay? If they have a FCC license, they're FCC regulated, okay? To what you watch on TV and the content on TV. All that stuff is regulated by law. All right. So we have to understand this. Because Republicans are in control of the U.S. Senate, Mitch McConnell is Senate Majority Leader. He determines which bills get voted on, which bills get debated on. He does not have to allow a bill, even if it passed the House of Representatives by overwhelming majority, 420 to 0. There should be 435 members in the House, but I think there's some vacant seats. But in general, there are 435 members in the House of Representatives. All right. So if H.R. 40 passes the House of Representatives and goes to the Senate, Mitch McConnell does not have to allow for a vote or a debate in the U.S. Senate. This is an example of how elections have consequences. This is why I try to explain to people when they say, well, what do I care about a senator in Kentucky? I'm like, fool, are you crazy? Do you actually understand this? You actually understand what the Senate does, how the Senate works? This is why I explain to people, you can't just focus on president. You got to focus on the Congress. Congress writes laws. The president signs the laws into law. He signs bills into law that pass Congress. Congress writes laws. It's the U.S. Senate that confirms not just Supreme Court justices. They confirm federal judges. Trump has nominated 145 federal judges. He's nominated about 1 out of 5 federal judges that are on the bench right now. Those are lifetime appointments. And he's nominating largely unqualified, ultra conservative white males to be federal judges. And these are lifetime appointments. Okay, so when we did now, all this deals with history. All this ties into history. Why? Because 2013, U.S. Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and most people don't even understand. The Voting Rights Act comes out of the Civil Rights Movement. When we talk about Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, okay, they're fighting not for the right to vote. They're fighting to have their right to vote enforced, because it was the 15th Amendment of 1870 that gave African-American men the right to vote. Then it was the 19th Amendment of 1920. It gave largely white women the right to vote. You had African-American women who were voting up north. You're going to have African-American women voting up north, but in the South, you have all these obstacles put in the way of them being able to vote. Okay, so they have to pass literacy tests. They have to recite the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Okay, in Mississippi, they had to be able to explain to the satisfaction of the registrar one of the sections of the Mississippi U.S. Constitution. There's something like 200 sections or something crazy like that. In Eyes on the Prize, they talk about this. In Eyes on the Prize, when they deal with the fight for the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act did not give African Americans the right to vote. That was the 15th Amendment of 1870. What it did was it removed those obstacles. It largely enforces the right to vote, and it removed those obstacles, but it put oversight. Okay, so on those former states that had a history, especially these southern states, most of them former Confederate states like Mississippi, those states that had a history of putting obstacles in the way of African Americans being able to vote, there was federal oversight over those cities and counties. So if they want to make any changes to the number of weekends that you're going to have souls to the polls voting, number of weekends you're going to have early voting, or number of days you're going to have early voting, where you're going to have polling places. If they wanted to make any changes, they had to get approval from a federal judge. Okay, Shelby County versus Holder, U.S. Supreme Court case 2013. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the oversight, okay, which meant that these former states that had a history of depriving African Americans of the right to vote, now they don't have to get approval from a federal judge to make any changes. Right after that, you started seeing all these new voter ID laws, okay? We saw the voter ID laws come in. We saw a rise of them in 2010. But you really gonna have a lot more coming after 2013, after Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is struck down. So then in the 2016 election, that was the first presidential election that you did not have the full weight, the full enforcement of the Voting Rights Act in 50 years. So what happened? You have 14 new states that have new voter ID laws. You're going to have the U.S. interstate cross-checking system that's going to be used, that's going to knock 1.1 million people off the voter rolls. And you surprised when Trump wins Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by 78,000 popular votes. He won Michigan by 10,704 votes. 54,000 people were knocked off the voter rolls because of the interstate cross-checking system. We still don't understand the rapid voter suppression that took place. I'm not even talking about the Russian intervention, where Russians spent $100,000, took out about 3,500 Facebook ads that reached about 126 million people. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the rapid voter suppression coming from Republicans in the 2016 election, and they're going to engage in it again in 2020. They engaged in it some in 2018, but there was a huge blue wave that overcame that. In general, we saw voter suppression in Georgia with Brian Kemp, who was running for governor and he's Secretary of State, running against Stacey Abrams. All right, so we still saw it some, but we were largely able to overcome some of it, but it's going to be even worse in 2020. Now, all this deals with history. All this deals with understanding the legacy of slavery and understand going through Reconstruction, and after Reconstruction, reversing the gains that African Americans made, targeting them, putting obstacles in the way of them to vote. All this deals with history. So when you have a Mitch McConnell saying, quote, "We tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president. I think we're always a work in progress, in this country." Well, let me break this down, because what he just said was a bunch of BS. First of all, the Civil War was not fought to end slavery. The Civil War was fought to bring the South back into the Union. March 4th, 1861, the month before the Civil War starts, Lincoln's inaugural address, Lincoln proclaimed that it was his duty to maintain the Union. He also declared that he had no intention of ending slavery where it existed or of repealing the fugitive slave law, a position that horrified African Americans and their white allies. Lincoln's statement, however, did not satisfy the Confederacy, and on April 12th, 1861, they attacked Fort Sumter, which is a federal stronghold in Charleston, South Carolina, and this started the Civil War. Read the article from pbs.org, The Civil War and Emancipation, the Civil War and Emancipation. So you can't say we fought a civil war. We tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war. You can't say that, because the Civil War wasn't fought to end slavery. This is an example how elections have consequences. Senator Mitch McConnell is one of the probably next to Speaker Pelosi, because she's third in line. Well, second. She's second in line to the White House. If something happens to Trump and Pence, she becomes president. Speaker Pelosi is very powerful. She controls the House of Representatives. Mitch McConnell is very powerful. He controls the U.S. Senate. When you got somebody this ignorant talking this type of nonsense, and this the same guy who determines which bills get voted on in the U.S. Senate, this is an example of how elections have consequences. This is why Mitch McConnell must be voted out of office in 2020. So this is the article from the Washington Post. McConnell says he's against reparations for slavery. Quote, "It would be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate." End quote. Well, you don't have to figure that out. That's what the commission does. Let them do that. But for him to have the nerve to mention that we elected an African-American president, I think we're always in progress. I think we're always a work in progress in this country. I recall right after President Obama was elected, Mitch McConnell and some of the other Republicans had a meeting, and they said that, quote, "The single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president," end quote. So how could you claim that President Obama becoming president, you all electing an African-American president, is somehow reparations, or is somehow a work in the country is always a work in progress? How how can you bring that up when you did everything you could to block bills that President Obama was trying to get passed? How could you bring that up when you, Senator Mitch McConnell, took pride in blocking Judge Merrick Garland, who was President Obama's nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court? You kept that seat open for an entire year. So how could you, on the one hand, claim that, well, we elected an African American president, but then on the other hand, you did everything you could to block his bills and block his nominations for not just the U.S. Supreme Court, but also those last 2 years when because Republicans gained back control of the U.S. Senate in 2014 midterm elections. Okay. So what McConnell and Republicans did, now that they control the U.S. Senate, they blocked a lot of President Obama's federal bench nominations as well, which left all these vacancies in the federal bench when Trump became president. So this is, once again, and when you got somebody as devious, okay, as Mitch McConnell, this is an example, once again, why he must be voted out of office. You can't play with people like this. This is what I'm trying to explain to people. Do you understand how important the U.S. Senate is? So even if H.R. 40 passes the House of Representatives, it's most likely it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate, not with this current Senate. Now, if Democrats take back control of the U.S. Senate, it can probably pass the Senate. But Mitch McConnell's got to go. If we look at the now, all this ties into history. It ties into slavery, Civil War, 246 years of slavery, going to Civil War, Reconstruction, going to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, goes into World War I, 1914 to 1918, the beginning of the Great Migration, the second year of World War I, 1915 to 1970, Great Migration, 6 million African Americans migrating from the South up north and out west. This deals with the legacy of the Homestead Act of 1862, redistributing 245 million acres of land. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866, redistributing about 45 million acres of land. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, redistributing about 138 million acres of land. And African Americans are largely locked out of hundreds of millions of land that's redistributed after we worked the land for free for 246 years. They should have had me on the panel. But anyway, all right, so let's look quickly at this article from npr.org. How's everybody doing? Some of us think there's a group of people sitting around a table, okay, spitting tobacco. All right, let's see here. We have A banks. All right, they understand the investment that has been made to be white. Whites know that a white high school dropout head of household has more wealth than a Black American head of household with a degree. All right. Also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. That helps us to keep doing the research, stay on the air, pay the bills, helps when I have to travel to this past weekend. I was in Atlanta for the Juneteenth festival. You see me with my Juneteenth t-shirt on. Okay. This is I got at the Juneteenth festival in Atlanta. All right. Okay. So paypal.me/the AHN show. If we and then read the article dealing with the Homestead Act also. Okay. Because they gave, with the Homestead Act, they gave away land for over 100 years. The last allotment was given away, was allocated about like 1988. All right. Did you know the Homestead Act remained in effect for more than 100 years? The final claim for 80 acres in southeastern Alaska was approved in 1988. So Mitch McConnell has no problem with benefiting from the legacy of slavery. He just doesn't want to be held accountable for it. Interesting. All right. Okay. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Okay, so if we look at this article, it was a good article from NPR.org, National Public Radio. And this article dealt with a congressional hearing on slavery reparations set for Wednesday. This is from June 18th, 2019. This gives some background information. Now, I'm not sure. I caught the last 2 hours. Did they talk about House Resolution 194 in the 110th Congress, July 29th, 2008? Did they talk about that? Because that was an official apology for slavery. That was from the House of Representatives. And if they didn't talk about this, this is something they really should talk about. The reason why is because House Resolution 194, and I've dealt with this in my radio shows and some of my lectures, this helps to really lay the foundation for the need for reparations. You've heard me talk before about how January 1st, 1808, the U.S. Congress outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, the importation of Africans into this country as slaves, as dictated by Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. Okay. Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution calls for the importation of Africans to be outlawed at the earliest 1808. That's in the Constitution. All right. Now, very briefly here, and I'll give you the link for it. This is at govtrack.us, govtrack.us. All the bills passed in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, you can research at govtrack, track.us. All right, a lot of people don't know this, but we'll post this right here. So this, the 200th year anniversary of the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade, you had some commemorations in this country and also in Great Britain, because they outlawed it at the same time, basically at the same time. So House Resolution 194 in the 110th Congress coincided with that, okay, that 200-year anniversary. And it's entitled Apologizing for the Enslavement and Racial Segregation of African Americans. Okay, I'll just share a portion of it, I think. So it talks about how whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the 13 American colonies from 1619 through 1865. Keep in mind, the Spanish were enslaving Africans going back to the 1520s, like in South Carolina. But South Carolina at that time, that was Spanish territory. Whereas slavery in America resembled no other form of involuntary servitude known in history, as Africans were captured and sold at auction like inanimate objects or animals. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated. Let me skip past some of this. I want to get to the really important. Whereas the system of slavery and the visceral racism against persons of African descent upon which it depended became entrenched in the nation's social fabric, whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by virulent racism, lynchings, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws that imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life. This is House Resolution 194 from the House of Representatives. Okay. And what they're doing is laying out what a history of what happened to African Americans in this country coming out of slavery, in slavery and coming out of slavery, the Reconstruction era, etc., going into the Jim Crow era. So whereas the system of de jure racial segregation known as Jim Crow, which arose in certain parts of the nation following the Civil War to create separate and unequal societies for whites and African Americans, was a direct result of the racism against persons of African descent engendered by slavery. They're showing Jim Crow comes right out of slavery. Separate and equal, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, This brings this cements and really legalizes the Jim Crow to then segregate African Americans, to lock them out of opportunity. All right. This is a legacy of slavery. Now, whereas a century after the official end of slavery in America, federal action was required during the 1960s to eliminate the de jure and de facto system of Jim Crow throughout parts of the nation, though its vestiges still linger to this day. If it had not been for Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws, the segregation laws, and these are locking African Americans out of employment opportunities. These are locking African Americans out of the ability to vote. Okay, even though their taxpayer dollars are paying the salaries for elected officials, all right, they're being locked out of these opportunities. If it had not been for slavery, you would not have needed Plessy versus Ferguson. You would not have needed things like the Civil Rights Act of 1865, which was vetoed. You would not have needed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which laid the foundation for the 14th Amendment. If it had not been for Jim Crow, which is being enforced in these southern states, these largely former slaveholding states, you would not have needed a civil rights movement. You needed a civil rights movement because African Americans were fighting for rights that were promised to us in the Constitution, but they were not actually enforced. This is a legacy of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a legacy of slavery. So when you have an idiot like Senator Mitch McConnell saying, I don't think reparations was something that happened 150 years ago, for which none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. You still have African Americans who still remember Jim Crow. You still got white people who still remember Jim Crow laws. All this history is connected. This is why we must understand the chronology of history. This is why something like this has to be used in every school in the country, teaching hard history, American slavery, teaching hard history, American slavery. From the Southern Poverty Law Center, splcenter.org, splcenter.org. It's a 52-page study that documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in schools. They did a survey of 1,000 12th graders. Out of 1,000 12th graders, they found only 8% out of 1,000 knew that the central reason why the Civil War was fought was because of slavery. It wasn't states' rights. Is because of slavery. Now, they wanted the right to maintain slaves. They wanted the right to maintain enslaved Africans because they talked about in their statements of secession, they talked about how slavery was central to maintaining their way of life. So this is why we must understand the chronology of history. Okay, this is all this in history, and laws and policies are interconnected, interrelated. When you read How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy, they deal with this. And this is one of the books we use in the online courses, reference in the online course also. Okay. There's a number of books I use in the online course. We'll post a link again here for the online course. You all can register for that. If you register, now this is the updated version. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, 2019 edition. Okay. It's a 8-week, 16-hour online course that I teach. There were thousands of years of history. First session starts today, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the full course is $80, and you can watch it. You can watch it over and over again. All the sessions will be recorded. We do them live, but they will be recorded. There's about 36 hours of bonus content. So the last time I taught this online class was September 2017. That full previous class is there, plus additional bonus content. And then you'll be enrolled for the new class as well. And that starts up Wednesday, June 19th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Okay, so we posted the link here for you. And if you've taken the online course before, email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com, customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. And we'll enroll you at 50% off. Okay, if you've taken an online course before, we'll enroll you at 50% off. All right, let's continue. But we're going to deal with thousands of years of history. We deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors. We deal with ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. We deal with how all this leads to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. All right, let's continue here. Okay. So this is House Resolution 194. This is the official apology for slavery from the U.S. House of Representatives. The U.S. Senate did one also in 2008, 2009. The U.S. Senate did one as well. Okay, so whereas the system of the de jure racial segregation known as Jim Crow, which arose in certain parts of the nation following the Civil War to create separation and unequal societies for whites and African Americans, was a direct result of the racism against persons of African descent engendered by slavery. These are all legacies of slavery. Okay. Whereas a century after the official end of slavery in America, federal action was required during the 1960s to eliminate the de jure and de facto system of Jim Crow throughout parts of the nation, though its vestiges still linger to this day, whereas African Americans continue to suffer from the complex interplay between slavery and Jim Crow, long after both systems were formally abolished through enormous damage and loss, both tangible and intangible, including the loss of human dignity, the frustration of careers and professional lives, and the long-term loss of income and opportunity. So when we deal with the wage gap, median household income for white people as of 2016, a white family is $171,000. Median household income for an African American family is $17,000. All right, that wealth gap largely is tied to slavery, a maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources, but then also policies coming from the New Deal in the 1930s and 1940s during World War II. The Social Security Administration, founded in 1935, Minimum Wage Act, 1935, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, 1933, the Federal Housing Administration, 1934. And what's going to happen is, and then the GI Bill in 1944. These policies, these administrations that are created, and these policies are going to largely not include African Americans as far as giving out resources or being able to qualify for Social Security. Social Security and the Minimum Wage Act are going to discriminate against people who are farmers, domestics, people who are working even in barbershops, things like this. A lot of if you work in agriculture, the Social Security Administration and the Minimum Wage Act are not going to apply to you. So those two specifically did not necessarily discriminate based upon race. They discriminated based upon occupation. But we were locked into certain occupations because of racism as a legacy of slavery. Okay, see, once again, all this stuff is interconnected, interrelated. So we have to understand how this works so we don't fall for these games that are being played on this. Okay, so let's go back to House Resolution 194. Here we go. And I'm going to post a link here also on YouTube, and we're broadcasting on Crowdcast also, so we'll post it in Crowdcast as well. All right, and then also email me. Like I said, if you've taken the online course before, email me at customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. Customerservice@africanhistorynetwork.com. All right, let's continue here. Okay, whereas the story of the enslavement and de jure segregation of African Americans and the dehumanizing atrocities committed against them should not be purged from or minimized in the telling of American history. Whereas on July 8th, 2003, during a trip to Gorée Island, Senegal, a former slave port, President George W. Bush acknowledged slavery's continuing legacy in American life and the need to confront that legacy when he stated that slavery, quote, was one of the greatest crimes of history, The racial bigotry fed by slavery did not end with slavery or with segregation, and many of the issues that still trouble America have roots in the bitter experience of other times. But however long the journey, our destiny is set, liberty and justice for all, end quote. That was President George W. Bush, July 8th, 2003 in Senegal at Gorée Island. Okay. Then they talk about President Bill Clinton also acknowledged the deep-seated problems caused by the continuing legacy of racism against African Americans that began with slavery when he initiated a national dialogue about race. All right. Let's see. Okay, so you can read the rest of it. But what they do is they draw a connection between the legacy of slavery and how it impacts African Americans up to right now also, which is extremely important because a lot of people, when they make the argument for reparations, they just talk about for slavery. They don't connect that to housing discrimination, Jim Crow, GI Bill, all these things. You have to understand the chronology of history. All of that is connected. Okay, so check that out. Now, if we look at the article from NPR.org dealing with, let's see, article from NPR.org, congressional hearing on slavery reparations set for Wednesday. This is July 18th, 2019. And it talks about how we know the sponsor of the bill, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. Okay. Originally, this bill was introduced in 1989 by Representative John Conyers. And the bill has been, it was a bill to do a 7-year study to determine, originally it was to determine, it was a 7-year study to determine like the impact of slavery, things like this. But now it's been revamped to not just call for a commission to study slavery, but the House Judiciary Committee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties is holding the hearing on H.R. 40, which calls for a commission to, quote, study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Okay. It's not just a study to determine the impact of slavery. Okay. It's also to develop reparation proposals for African Americans, quote, including a formal apology by the U.S. government, quote, for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants, end quote. Okay. So this revised H.R. 40 is more comprehensive. The commission has the support of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Aside from Senator Cory Booker, several other Democratic presidential aspirants have expressed support for some form of reparations, including Beto O'Rourke, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and former Secretary of Housing and Urban Affairs, Julian Castro. Okay. Let's see. So they talk about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, his idiotic remarks. Now, I think on MSNBC today, a representative had to explain Joe Biden's stance on this. All right. So Vice.com has an article from June 19th, 2019. Democrats want to tackle reparations, but Joe Biden isn't so sure. The former vice president continues to split with the more left-wing candidates he's running against. I want to get to the actual comment from Joe Biden. He's not totally against reparations. I want to get the actual comment here. Hold on. The screen was refreshing. So let's see here. Okay, but for Joe Biden, Democratic front runner won't go there. In a statement to Vice.com this week for a story about healthcare reparations, A Biden spokesperson said the former vice president, quote, believes that we should gather the data necessary to have an informed conversation about reparations. But he has not endorsed a specific bill, meaning he has not endorsed H.R. 40. Okay. According to this spokesperson, he, quote, believes that we should gather the data necessary to have an informed conversation about reparations, but he has not endorsed a specific bill, end quote. That means, unlike the majority of the 2020 field, Biden does not necessarily support a reparations commission, the latest issue separating him from the progressives he's running against. Okay. Now, hold on. Somebody's trying to send me a message here on Facebook. I hate this stuff. All right. Let's see. His statement on reparations matched that of a candidate perfectly content to play it safe, as his critics have charged. Some speculate he's taking that position because he's trying to win some southern states, some southern Republican states. Quote, I have the sense that he is trying to play to a segment of Trump's voting base that he thinks can be swayed to vote for the Democratic Party again, said William Darity, Darity, a professor of economics, African-American studies, and public policy at Duke University, and a leading scholar on reparations. Quote, consequently, there's absolutely no way he would indicate that he was supportive of any aspect of a move to achieve reparations for Black Americans, for Black American descendants of folks who were enslaved, end quote. Okay. So you can check out the rest of this article from vice.com. All right. But I wanted to mention that as well. Now, personally, having studied this for a number of years, reparations is a long shot. Personally, as long as Trump's in office, reparations is not happening, because that has to be signed in law. If that has to be signed in law by the president. Okay, that has to be signed in law by the president. So let me see. Go back to YouTube. Okay, so let's share this link here. You can read this article in its entirety from vice.com. And what we have to understand also is, just a second. What we have to understand also is that with certain candidates, you may not get an agreement on everything you want up front. But there's certain candidates who can be pushed in the right direction to do the right thing. So we have to make a distinction between that as well. There's certain candidates who can be pushed, who can be reasoned with and pushed in the right direction. Trump is not one of them, however. That's what we have to understand. Trump is not one of them. All right. So we'll have the link for the 3-hour Juneteenth lecture that I did. You definitely want to get a copy of that. I think it'll be $10. It's a 2 DVD set, and we'll have it on digital download also. So digital download will probably be like $8. All right, I have to get that up. The online course starts tonight. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa. Understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. That's a 14-hour, 7-session. It's an 8-week, 16-hour online course. Okay. And I'm going to do a brief overview. We'll deal with some of the information that we're going to cover. I do a PowerPoint presentation, and we deal with thousands of years of history also. Let me bring this up here. Okay. We have video clips. We have book references. So after this course, I mean, like, you'll never be the same. It really, really, I've had a number of people who've gone through it. It's over 100, I think, who've taken it, and it totally blows them away. All right. let's look at this. Let's turn the screen share on. And I am in Crowdcast, so let's turn this on here. Okay, I'm going to show you, give you a brief overview of what we'll cover. So to understand the transatlantic slave trade, we have to understand hundreds of years of history leading up to the transatlantic slave trade. It did not, it's not something that you see that lead up to the transatlantic slave trade happening. Okay. And if you need me to post a link again to register for the online course, let me know. And we also have it in the description of this broadcast as well. All right. When we look at one of the things I talk about in the new class is the study from the Southern Poverty Law Center, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. That's one of the things that I talk about. And I deal with how I deal with how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in schools all across the country. This is from an article from theatlantic.com, what kids are really learning about slavery, what kids are really learning about slavery. Okay. And it talks about that study from the Southern Poverty Law Center that I mentioned. All right. One of the things they found is that 68% of high school seniors did not know that it took a constitutional amendment to formally end slavery. Only 32% knew that the 13th Amendment is what formally ended slavery. 35% thought it was the Emancipation Proclamation. So when we see things like this, what this means is one, the teachers didn't teach them at the school. Two, their parents didn't teach them. Their parents didn't teach them any better. All right. Okay. So then we deal with some of the problems with the way slavery is taught. Very quickly, I want to get into this here. We'll do some with the Black Panther comic book as well. Black Panther movie, I should say. Here's some of the things we deal with. What was the transatlantic slave trade? What were some of the events that led up to the transatlantic slave trade starting? We have to understand these things chronologically. Okay. When we understand the wars fought between the Moors and Europeans, we understand the Moors intermixing with the Europeans, intermixing with their bloodline, intermixing with white women. We see the complexion of Europeans changing in Spain and Portugal, especially because that's right above Morocco. But also we see some of them changing all throughout Europe. Okay. So when we look at Queen Charlotte Sophia, who was the wife of King George III, she was of African ancestry, African Moorish ancestry on her mother's side. These are the kings and queens during the American Revolutionary War, 1775, 1783. The 13 colonies are fighting to separate from King George III. His wife was of African ancestry. You're going to have a lot of people in Europe who have a Moorish ancestor because the Moors are intermixing with the European population. Okay, so when we understand the transatlantic slave trade and we understand the history of the Moors in Europe, the transatlantic slave trade is really Europeans getting revenge on these Africans and on these Moors. It's really Europeans getting revenge on them if you actually understand what's taking place. So what were some of the events that led up to the transatlantic slave trade starting? What role did Christopher Columbus play? Because Columbus is central to understanding the spread of the transatlantic slave trade. Columbus and his 4 voyages, starting August 3rd, 1492, when he set sail on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. When did Africans first come to the U.S. as slaves? Did Africans sell themselves into slavery? We deal with that complicated history. Okay, now this is, keep in mind, this is over the course of 8 weeks, right? This is not all in one class. Were African people in America before the slave trade? Absolutely. We're dealing with, you have to understand that African people have been in this land that we call the United States of America going back at least 51,700 years. At least 51,700 years. We deal with information from Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. Okay, let me take the screen share off for a minute here. We deal with information from Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. His book thoroughly documents an African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. Okay, this is before Native Americans come into existence. So this book is out of print. His new book comes out in July. I talked to him about a month ago. His new book is The First Americans Were Africans Revisited. The First Americans Were Africans Revisited. Let me look at some of the comments here on YouTube. All right, how's everybody doing? We've got Jim. President not a kingship, it needs to go forward anyway. The president is not a kingship, it needs to go forward anyway. That's true, but if the president vetoes it, then you need a supermajority. Then if the president vetoes, if somehow HR 40 passes the House and it passes the Senate, whoever is president can veto it. To override that veto, you need a supermajority. Okay, that means you need a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate. A 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate. That's a supermajority. If you don't have a supermajority, then the veto from the president stands. This is why elections have consequences. You haven't heard anything from Trump about reparations, but I guarantee you, if he says something about reparations, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be, he's for it. If Trump would not give an apology or admit he was wrong when it comes to the Central Park 5, you think he's actually going to, sign into law reparations for African Americans? If he won't admit he was wrong about taking out a full page ad in 4 New York newspapers calling for the death penalty to be brought back, okay, for the Central Park 5, and they're later exonerated, DNA clears them, the real killer is caught, okay, they're totally exonerated. If Trump won't even admit he's wrong there and won't even issue an apology, what do you think he's going to do with reparations? And we're talking about chattel slavery ending 154 years ago. This is an example of how elections have consequences. This is what people don't want to realize. All right. Okay, let's continue here. Okay, let's go back to the screen share. Let's turn this back on. I'm using Crowdcast to broadcast through YouTube, so I got to get a little used to this again. It's different than Zoom. Okay. Just a second. Let's turn this back on. So we'll deal with were African people in America before the slave trade? Yes, we were. This was our land stolen from us. Even though the transatlantic slave trade did happen, we had been in this land for tens of thousands of years, and there were mounds that the African people like the Khoisan, who come from Southern Africa, who were the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. There were about 1 million mounds in this land, and today there are only about 100,000 of them. There were mounds up and down the Mississippi River. We'll deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors, which is critical to understanding the history of the transatlantic slave trade. Unfortunately, oftentimes the transatlantic slave trade is taught episodically. It's taught as an episode in history. So they'll start in the mid 1440s or mid 1400s, right? They won't deal with the hundreds of years of history before that. And that's what you have to understand the transatlantic slave trade. Shocking archaeological discoveries that are causing experts to rethink everything. Insurance companies that took out insurance policies on slave ships and enslaved Africans on plantations. We'll deal with Freemasonry, America, and the Founding Fathers, origins of the terms America and Africa. The problem with slave movies, we'll deal with Asar, Set, and Heru, who the Greeks called Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and the origins of the Immaculate Conception story. So there's a lot that we deal with in the online course. Okay, that's Renoko Rashidi. It's a lot that we deal with. Let me see something here. We go to Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence, right? This book came out in 2011, has 713 footnotes, thoroughly documenting an African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. In Allendale County, South Carolina, in 2004, Dr. Albert Goodyear, who's an archaeologist at the University of South Carolina, made a discovery and they found 13 different pieces of evidence that thoroughly documented African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. Okay. All right. They found artifacts, architecture, campsites, carvings, footprints in lava, Egyptian writings, genetic M174D haploid groups dealing with DNA and genetics. They found linguistics, paintings, skulls, skeletons, structures, and tools. They found 13 different disciplines thoroughly documented in African presence in this country going back at least 51,700 years ago. Here's an article from ScienceDaily.com from November 18th, 2004. This article is about Dr. Albert Goodyear's discovery. It's entitled, New Evidence Puts Man in North America 50,000 Years Ago. Here's a picture of Dr. Albert Goodyear. Here's a summary of what his article is about. Now, this is not my summary. This is a summary from ScienceDaily.com, which is a scientific website. Radiocarbon tests of carbonized plant remains where artifacts were unearthed last May along the Savannah River in Allendale County by University of South Carolina archaeologist Dr. Albert Goodyear indicate that the sediments containing these artifacts are at least 50,000 years old, meaning that humans inhabited North America long before the last ice age. Now, this is before Native Americans even come into existence, because Asians come to this land about 3000 BC. Asians intermix with the Africans that are already here, and their offspring are who we call Native Americans. These are some discoveries, some statues discovered in the Tanis Heraklion, which is the lost city of Egypt, that was a city swallowed into the sea around 1200 years ago. Okay, so we deal with a number of different archaeological discoveries. There's some new ones as well that we'll deal with also. Okay, but we'll deal with the Africans known as the Moors, of course, have to deal with that. And we deal with what the Moors took into Europe. So the Moors take the teachings from ancient Kemet into Europe and bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. And this helps to lay the foundation for Freemasonry. When we look at the Washington Monument, is a tekhen. It's a structure called a tekhen. The Greeks called it an obelisk. There are about 1,200 tekhenu all throughout ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. Okay. And we know the layout of Washington, D.C. was done by Benjamin Banneker. Banneker was a master astronomer, most likely descendant of the Dogon. And the layout of Washington, D.C. is a copy of ancient Egypt. So if you read Egypt on the Potomac by Tony Browder, this is something Browder talks about extensively in Egypt on the Potomac. Well, when we look at Freemasonry and the word Mason, right? The word Mason is derived from the Latin words mass and sun. Mason means child of light and expresses the desire to pursue light, which is a metaphor for the sun, which symbolizes knowledge. The term child of light or sons and daughters of light was first used to identify students who had completed 42 years of study in the temples of ancient Kemet. Many Masonic temples were modeled after the temples of Kemet, places where light or knowledge was imparted in a series of steps or degrees. So the concept of you going to college, getting your credentials in a series of degrees, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, etc. This comes from ancient Kemet. The 7 liberal arts come from ancient Kemet, the rhetoric, the logic, arithmetic, things like that. And this is something that George G.M. James talks about in the book Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James. And he talks about the 7 liberal arts. He talks about the trivium and the quadrivium, the 3 and the 4. But he talks about how the Moors were the custodians of the ancient Egyptian mystery system. And they're going to take these teachings into Europe. Okay. Read pages 18 and 32 of Egypt on the Potomac by Tony Browder. And this is a famous statue of Heru, the son, Asar, the father, Aset, the mother, the wife. All right, so these are just some of the things we deal with in the online course. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Okay, it's a very deep course. You have a lot of information. we deal with these Moors' heads are on the national flags of Corsica and Sardinia, because the Moors were in those areas. It took a monumental effort to defeat them. The African Moors. So Columbus, when we study Columbus, what's interesting is that Columbus never comes to the land that we call the United States of America. The closest he comes here is Cuba, which is 90 miles away. This is why I show people in the online course, I show people where Columbus went on his 4 voyages. So we can stop saying Columbus discovered America. All right. So let's post a link again. Let's see here. Let's 30 minutes. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, let's look at the comments here on YouTube. If you need me to post the link again, so you can register for the online course, I'll do that as well. Online course is $80, regularly $130. Okay. And you can watch it over and over again. We do the class live, but then it's archived. The previous class that I did in September 2017, that full class is there, so you can watch that on demand. Also, I have about 20 additional hours of bonus content also. So it's about 36 hours, something like that. 36 hours of bonus content, something like that as well. All right, let's look at some of your comments here. Okay, we got Jim, we have Arlene. Okay, she's talking about the Central Park 5, the real, well, the jogger wasn't killed. The jogger was raped. The jogger in Central Park, the jogger was not killed. The real rapist was caught, and DNA evidence proved that this was the rapist, and the rapist also admitted it as well. Okay. All right. We'll post a link here. You can register for the online course, and you can watch it. You can, if you miss it tonight, you can, go back and watch it over and over again as well. You can watch from around the world also. So we'll post a link there, and then you can also donate to the African History Network. PayPal.me/the AHN show. PayPal.me/the AHN show. So that really helps support the African History Network, helps us to keep doing the research, stay on the air, pay the bills, finance our Sunday night show. If you want to advertise with the African History Network, email us at customer service at africanhistorynetwork.com, customer service at africanhistorynetwork.com also. Okay. And because we have a couple new advertisers, we have the people are trying to get back in shape for the summer, and we have the Fast Life 28-day challenge, the Fast Life 28-day challenge. Imagine your health. Imagine what your health could look like after 28 days of a structured fasting regimen, healthy habits, and 3 coaches holding you accountable on a daily basis. Okay. The Fast Life 28-day challenge is an online coaching program to help members tap into their body's natural ability to repair itself via fasting. In this challenge, they focus on utilizing fasting, whole foods, and movement to improve metabolic conditions such as obesity, high blood pressure, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and high cholesterol. Okay, visit their website, tfl28.com, tfl28.com for the Fast Life 28-day challenge. They also have a Facebook group, a secret Facebook group as well to help you. Okay. And they have a new group starting up very soon. So you can get more information on that, tfl28.com. All right. You can, if you want to advertise with the African History Network, email us at customer service at africanhistorynetwork.com, africanhistorynetwork.com. Okay. We have a current promotion right now. Get 2 months for the price of 1. All right, so look, hey, we have to get out of here. Register for the online course that we're doing also. And remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. And we'll talk to you next time. Peace.